For 9 long years, the greatest army the Greek world had ever assembled had camped on the shores below the walls of Troy. And for 9 long years, those walls had not fallen. Heroes had died in their thousands. The greatest warrior of the age had been killed by an arrow to the heel. And still, the gates of Troy stood shut. It would not be a spear, a wall-breaking ram, or a hero's rage that finally ended the siege. It would be a wooden horse, a lie whispered by a single man, and the vanity of a city that could not resist a gift. This is how ancient tradition recounts the fall of Troy and the trick that Odysseus used to win an impossible war. Chapter 1. A War That Would Not End. According to the tradition preserved by Homer and by the later poets of the so-called epic cycle, the war began with an insult too great for any king to ignore. Paris, a prince of Troy, had either seduced or abducted Helen, wife of King Menelaus of Sparta, carrying her back across the Aegean to his father's city. Menelaus's brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in Greece, called on every king and warlord bound by an old oath sworn years earlier by every one of Helen's suitors at her father's insistence to join a combined expedition against Troy. More than 1,000 ships, according to the traditional count preserved in the Iliad's famous catalogue, carried the assembled armies of Greece across the Aegean Sea. Troy itself was no minor prize. Positioned on the northwestern coast of Anatolia, commanding the narrow straits later known as the Hellespont, the city controlled trade routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea and had grown wealthy on tolls and tribute for generations before the Greeks ever arrived. Its walls, according to the same tradition, had been built by the gods Apollo and Poseidon themselves during a period of servitude to King Laomedon, Priam's father, and were consequently believed to be unbreachable by any purely mortal force. Whether or not any literal city matched every detail of this legend, archaeologists excavating the mound of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey since the 19th century have uncovered the remains of a genuinely fortified Bronze Age settlement at the site tradition identified with Troy, destroyed by violence at roughly the period the ancient Greeks themselves believed the war had taken place. A discovery that transformed what many had assumed was pure myth into a question with at least some basis in archaeological fact, even if the precise events remain impossible to confirm.
The scale of the expedition assembled against the city was, in the tradition preserved by Homer, staggering for a Bronze Age world. The Iliad's catalogue of ships, a lengthy and famously exhaustive passage listing the contingents that sailed from every corner of the Greek world, names contingents from Mycenae, Sparta, Ithaca, Crete, and dozens of lesser kingdoms and city-states, totaling, by the poem's own count, more than 1,000 ships and, by later ancient estimates, well over 100,000 men. Numbers modern historians regard with considerable skepticism given what is actually known of Bronze Age population and logistics, but which nonetheless conveyed to ancient audiences the sense of an assembled host unlike anything seen before or since. The first arrival of the fleet at Troy was itself said to have been marked by tragedy. An oracle had warned that the first Greek to touch Trojan soil would be the first to die, and the warrior Protesilaus, either unaware of the prophecy or willing to accept it, leapt ashore first and was killed almost immediately by Hector, becoming the war's first casualty before the siege proper had even begun. The war that followed, as the tradition tells it, ground on for 9 years without a decisive result. The Greek army encamped on the beach below the city, launching raids against Troy's allied towns along the coast, but never quite able to breach the city's defenses outright. The 10th year, the year in which the Iliad itself is set, brought catastrophe after catastrophe for both sides. A bitter quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles, the greatest warrior in the Greek army, son of the sea nymph Thetis and, by most accounts, invulnerable everywhere on his body except the heel by which his mother had once held him while dipping him in the river Styx, led Achilles to withdraw from the fighting entirely in a rage over a captured woman Agamemnon had claimed as a prize.
Without him, the Greek army suffered badly. and only after his closest companion, Patroclus, was killed, wearing Achilles' own armor, did the great warrior return to the field, killing the Trojan champion Hector, Priam's eldest son, in single combat outside the city walls, and dragging his body behind a chariot in a display of grief and fury that even his own allies found disturbing. Achilles himself did not long survive his enemy. Struck by an arrow, guided, in most versions of the story, by the god Apollo, and aimed with fatal precision at the one unprotected spot on his body, he died before the gates of Troy, and a bitter contest broke out among the surviving Greek commanders over who deserved to inherit his magnificent armor, forged by the god Hephaestus himself. The prize went, in most versions, not to the enormous and famously straightforward warrior Ajax, who believed his battlefield service entitled him to it, but to Odysseus, king of Ithaca, celebrated less for brute strength than for cunning, patience, and a gift for persuasive speech that had already made him one of the most influential voices in the Greek war council. Ajax, humiliated by the judgment, was driven mad with rage that night, according to the tradition later dramatized by Sophocles. Slaughtering a flock of sheep he mistook in his delusion for the Greek commanders who had wronged him, and took his own life in shame once his sanity returned and he understood what he had done. The war had already claimed its two greatest champions, and Troy's walls still stood.
Chapter 2: The Impossible Wall.
By the 10th year, both sides were exhausted in ways that went far beyond simple battlefield casualties. The Greek army, encamped for a decade on a foreign shore, faced chronic shortages of food and supplies, periodic outbreaks of plague blamed on divine anger, and a home front back in Greece that many suspected was growing restless without its kings and warriors, a suspicion later traditions confirmed in gruesome detail, describing the troubled homecomings that awaited several of the war's surviving leaders, Agamemnon among them, murdered in his own bath upon returning to Mycenae. Troy, for its part, had lost its finest defender in Hector, and increasingly relied on allied contingents drawn from across Anatolia, and even, in some traditions, from as far as Ethiopia and the Amazons, whose queen, Penthesilea, died fighting Achilles shortly before his own death. Greek tradition held that Troy could not fall through ordinary force of arms alone, no matter how prolonged the siege. Even the Greek camp itself, by the 10th year, had become a source of internal strain nearly as dangerous as the enemy across the field. Agamemnon's authority over the coalition of kings he commanded was never absolute. Each contingent answered in the end to its own ruler, bound only by the old oath and by whatever personal loyalty individual commanders felt toward the larger cause. And the quarrel with Achilles that opens the Iliad was hardly the only moment at which that fragile coalition nearly collapsed.
Several ancient sources describe recurring debates within the Greek council over whether the war was even still winnable. Debates serious enough that Agamemnon, in one notorious episode preserved in the Iliad itself, tested his own army's morale by publicly proposing that they abandon the siege and sail for home, only to be horrified when the exhausted troops took him seriously and began rushing for the ships, forcing Odysseus to intervene personally, moving through the panicked camp to shame and cajole the army back into formation. A cluster of prophecies gathered by different poets across the centuries specified an oddly particular set of conditions that had to be met before the city's fate could be sealed. The Greeks needed the bow and arrows of Heracles, then in the possession of the wounded, embittered archer Philoctetes, abandoned years earlier on the island of Lemnos after a snakebite left him in agony and his festering wound made him unbearable company for the rest of the fleet. They needed Achilles' own son, Neoptolemus, brought into the war despite his youth,
fetched from the island of Skyros by Odysseus himself in a mission that echoed, in reverse, his earlier discovery of Achilles hidden among the same king's daughters. And they needed to steal a sacred statue of Athena, the Palladium, from within Troy's own citadel, a mission Odysseus and the warrior Diomedes carried out together in a daring night raid deep inside the city's walls, according to the tradition preserved in the lost epic known as the Little Iliad. One by one, through diplomacy, cunning, and outright theft, the Greeks satisfied each condition tradition demanded. And still, remarkably, the walls themselves would not fall to any direct assault. Something else would be needed, not strength, but deception.
Chapter 3. The Mind of Odysseus. Odysseus had built his reputation on cunning long before the final trick that would make his name immortal. Tradition credits him with orchestrating several of the war's most consequential episodes of deception from its very beginning. When the original oath-bound suitors were first summoned to fulfill their promise to defend Helen's marriage, Odysseus himself had tried to avoid the war entirely, feigning madness by yoking an ox and a horse together to plow a field and sowing it with salt rather than seed, a ruse exposed only when Palamedes, sent to recruit him, placed Odysseus's infant son Telemachus directly in the path of the plow, forcing Odysseus to swerve and reveal his sanity. The two men became lasting rivals as a result, and later tradition holds that Odysseus quietly engineered Palamedes' death by forging a letter that made him appear to be a Trojan spy, a story that, whether or not any historical core lies beneath it, captures precisely the reputation Odysseus carried among his own allies: brilliant, useful, and not entirely to be trusted. It was Odysseus, too, who tracked down Achilles years earlier, when the young warrior's mother, aware of a prophecy that he would die at Troy, had disguised him among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros. Odysseus arrived posing as a merchant, laying out jewelry and fine cloth alongside a sword and shield among his wares. And when a sudden trumpet blast sounded an apparent alarm, it was Achilles, alone among the supposed young women, who instinctively reached for the weapons rather than the jewelry, exposing himself immediately. By the war's 10th year, this pattern was well established. Whenever the Greek army faced a problem that could not be solved by force alone, command increasingly turned to Odysseus, celebrated in Homer's own words as the man of twists and turns, polytropos, a Greek epithet that carries connotations of cleverness bordering on slipperiness even in the original language. Before we continue, a quick reading recommendation for anyone who wants to dig deeper into the war and its aftermath. Emily Wilson's acclaimed modern translation of the Odyssey renders Homer's own account of Odysseus's long, disaster-strewn journey home in vivid, accessible English, and its introduction offers an excellent grounding in how the war and the trick that ended it were understood by the Greeks themselves. A link is in the description below. Chapter 4. The Plan. According to the tradition most fully preserved in Virgil's Aeneid, composed centuries after Homer by a Roman poet drawing on earlier Greek sources now largely lost, it was Odysseus who first proposed the idea of a massive hollow wooden horse to the Greek command, persuaded that no direct assault would ever succeed where a decade of direct assaults already had not. The horse itself held deep symbolic significance for the Trojans, sacred to Poseidon, a god the Trojans had particular reason to want to appease, given that Poseidon, along with Apollo, had, according to the same tradition, built Troy's walls originally and then been cheated of proper payment by Priam's father, a betrayal the god was believed to still resent. A horse offered as an apparent peace gesture to Poseidon carried a weight of meaning that any ordinary siege engine never could. The construction itself was entrusted to Epeius, a skilled craftsman and, according to some traditions, a rather unimpressive fighter, more valued for his hands than his spear, a detail some ancient sources treat with gentle mockery, noting that a war finally decided by carpentry rather than combat handed unexpected glory to a man better known for building than for battle.
Epeius built the horse from the wood of Mount Ida's pine forests, hollow within and large enough, according to various ancient counts that range wildly between as few as a dozen and as many as several dozen warriors, including Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, and Epeius himself, sealed inside.
The plan required more than a horse. It required an entire elaborate performance of apparent Greek defeat. The bulk of the Greek fleet sailed away from Troy under cover of a single night, not going home at all, but withdrawing only as far as the nearby island of Tenedos, hidden from view of the Trojan walls, ready to return the moment a signal was given. Left behind on the abandoned beach, along with the horse itself, was a single Greek soldier named Sinon, who allowed himself to be captured by Trojan scouts and delivered before King Priam with a carefully rehearsed story. The Greeks, he claimed, exhausted after 10 years of fruitless war and warned by unfavorable omens, had finally abandoned the siege and sailed for home, leaving the horse behind as an offering to Athena, deliberately built too large to fit through Troy's gates so that the Trojans could never drag it inside their walls and claim its protective power for themselves. It was, Sinon insisted with apparent reluctance under threat, actually meant to atone for an earlier Greek offense against the goddess Athena, the theft of the Palladium, and its sheer size was a calculated Greek insurance policy meant to ensure that whichever side gained possession of it, they alone would win her favor. Nothing in the ruse was accidental. Every detail was engineered specifically to guarantee that Trojan pride would demand exactly the outcome the Greeks needed. Chapter 5. Doubts and Warnings. Not every Trojan believed the story, and tradition preserves at least two figures who came remarkably close to unraveling the entire scheme before it could succeed. Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, warned his fellow citizens in blunt terms not to trust the gift, delivering a line of suspicion so famous it survives in Latin translation to this day. He feared the Greeks even when bearing gifts. To emphasize his point, he reportedly hurled a spear into the horse's flank, and ancient sources describe a hollow, resonant sound echoing from within, a moment that should, by any reasonable judgment, have ended the deception on the spot. Instead, according to Virgil's account, two enormous serpents rose from the sea moments later and killed Laocoon along with his two young sons in full view of the horrified city, an event most Trojans immediately interpreted as divine punishment for his impiety toward what they now believed was Athena's sacred offering, rather than as the grim coincidence, or in some interpretations, deliberate divine intervention on the Greek side, that it may actually have been. Cassandra, a Trojan princess cursed by Apollo to foresee the truth with perfect accuracy while never being believed by anyone who heard her, is said to have also warned against bringing the horse inside the walls, recognizing precisely what it contained. Her warnings, as always, were dismissed by her own people as the ravings of a madwoman, a curse whose cruelty lay specifically in guaranteeing that correct knowledge would never translate into useful action. Between Laocoon's death, read as divine endorsement rather than warning, and Cassandra's ignored prophecy, whatever genuine suspicion had briefly taken hold among the Trojans evaporated. Debate within the city, according to several ancient accounts, remained divided for a time between those who wanted to burn the horse outright, those who wanted to hurl it from the cliffs into the sea, and those who wanted to honor it as a genuine offering to the gods and drag it into the city in triumph. The last faction won. Because the horse had been deliberately built too large to pass through Troy's gates, the Trojans were forced to tear down a section of their own celebrated walls to bring it inside, an image ancient audiences clearly appreciated for its irony, a city famous for impenetrable fortifications, demolishing part of them with their own hands in celebration to welcome in the very device that would destroy them. Trojan citizens crowned the horse with garlands, and it was hauled through the breach amid what several ancient sources describe as genuine city-wide celebration. The 10-year war finally, gloriously believed to be over. That night, the city gave itself over to feasting and drinking on a scale unmatched since the siege began, exhausted relief overwhelming any lingering caution. Chapter 6: The Fall of Troy. Late that night, once the celebrations inside Troy had finally quieted into drunken, exhausted sleep, Sinon slipped away to the horse and gave the signal. A trapdoor in the horse's belly opened, and the warriors hidden inside, cramped, according to some traditions, for the better part of a full day and night, barely daring to breathe as Trojan citizens celebrated mere feet from their hiding place, climbed down on a rope and began moving through the sleeping city. Their first objective was the city gates, which they threw open from within, while a fire signal, lit from Troy's highest point and visible for miles across the strait, alerted the Greek fleet waiting at Tenedos to return at once under cover of darkness. What followed, according to every surviving account, was not a battle in any conventional sense, but a massacre. The Greek army, having waited 10 years for this single night, showed little of the disciplined restraint that might have been expected of an army accepting a city's surrender. Instead, Troy was systematically burned, looted, and slaughtered through until dawn, its citizens caught almost entirely unarmed and unprepared, still sleeping off the previous night's celebration. King Priam himself was killed at the altar of Zeus within his own palace, cut down, according to Virgil's account, by Neoptolemus, Achilles' own son, who showed his father's fallen enemy none of the mercy Achilles himself had once briefly extended to the same old king when he came, unarmed, to beg for the return of Hector's body. Priam's infant grandson, Astyanax, Hector's own son, was thrown from the city's walls, a killing later Greek and Roman tradition alike treated with genuine moral discomfort, recognizing even in antiquity that this final act crossed from military victory into something closer to atrocity. Not every Trojan died. Aeneas, a Trojan prince and distant cousin of Priam's royal line, escaped the burning city, carrying his elderly father Anchises on his back and leading his young son Ascanius by the hand, according to the tradition that would eventually become the foundation of Virgil's entire Aeneid, in which Aeneas's small band of refugees, after years of wandering the Mediterranean, would eventually settle in Italy and found the line that Roman tradition believed led directly to the city of Rome itself, a detail that transformed Troy's destruction, in later Roman eyes, into something closer to a beginning than a pure ending. Helen, the war's original cause, survived the sack as well, reclaimed by Menelaus, who, according to several ancient traditions, raised his sword to kill her on the spot for the war her flight had caused, only to lower it, disarmed entirely by the sight of her beauty, a detail ancient audiences appear to have found both believable and faintly absurd in equal measure. By morning, Troy, a city that had withstood direct siege for 10 full years without ever once being breached by force, had fallen in a single night, brought down not by any weapon capable of piercing its legendary walls, but by a story convincing enough that an entire city demolished part of its own defenses to let the danger inside voluntarily. Ancient sources describe the survivors, mostly women and children, divided among the victorious Greek commanders as spoils of war. Hector's widow Andromache was given to Neoptolemus, Priam's wife Hecuba to Odysseus himself, and Cassandra dragged from Athena's altar to Agamemnon, who would carry her home to Mycenae only for her to share his fate at his wife's hands within the year, her own prophetic curse fulfilling itself one final bitter time. The war's aftermath scattered its Greek victors as thoroughly as it had scattered the Trojans they defeated. Agamemnon returned home to Mycenae only to be murdered by his own wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, in vengeance for the earlier sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia, an act that had been demanded years before to secure favorable winds for the fleet's original voyage to Troy. Ajax the Lesser, a separate figure from the larger Ajax who had taken his own life earlier in the war, committed such severe sacrilege during the sack of Troy, dragging Cassandra from the very altar of Athena where she had taken refuge, that the goddess herself wrecked much of the returning Greek fleet in a storm as punishment, drowning thousands of soldiers who had survived a full decade of war, only to die within sight of home. And Odysseus, the architect of the entire scheme that had finally won the war, found his own reward twisted into a curse. Rather than a swift voyage home, tradition condemned him to 10 more years of wandering, shipwreck, and disaster, the entire subject of Homer's Odyssey, as though the very cunning that had made him indispensable to his allies had marked him out, in the eyes of the gods, for a punishment precisely as elaborate as his own famous trick. Whether any of these individual details reflect events that actually happened remains, and will likely always remain, a matter of genuine scholarly uncertainty. Homer composed the Iliad and Odyssey centuries after the Bronze Age period in which the war was traditionally believed to have taken place, drawing on generations of oral poetic tradition that had almost certainly already reshaped, exaggerated, and reorganized whatever kernel of historical mummery the stories originally contained. The wooden horse itself appears nowhere in the Iliad at all, only briefly in the Odyssey, and receives its fullest treatment only much later in Virgil's Roman epic, composed more than 1,000 years after the Trojan War was supposedly fought. Archaeological excavation at Hisarlik has confirmed that a fortified, wealthy Bronze Age city genuinely existed at the site tradition identified with Troy, and that this city was violently destroyed at approximately the right period. But no archaeological evidence has ever confirmed a wooden horse, a 10-year siege, or any of the specific individuals whose names have echoed through Western literature for nearly 3,000 years. What survives, whatever its precise relationship to any literal historical event, is one of the oldest and most enduring stories ever told about how a war that could not be won by force alone was won instead by patience, psychology, and a single perfectly constructed lie, a trick so celebrated that its name became a permanent part of human language itself, still invoked today, more than 2,500 years later, whenever a hidden danger arrives disguised as a gift.